I've never talked about this publicly until today. I've never spent a day in an elementary or high school classroom. I've never ridden a school bus, I've never eaten in a lunchroom, and I've never done a fire drill. I've never had to ask to use the bathroom, and I really have no idea how schools actually work. The first test I ever took, I was 16. It was the PSAT. The first time I was ever in a classroom, enrolled in the class, was when I was 16 years old taking an intro to government class at our local community college. I was homeschooled from kindergarten through the end of high school, and today I'm going to talk about it. So my parents were both elementary school teachers back in the 90s. I have a sister who's 12 years older than me, so right as I was starting kindergarten, she was graduating high school. And at that point, my parents decided that they were going to homeschool me and my younger siblings. Let's get a couple things out of the way first. My name is Meshach. It's from the Old Testament of the Bible. If you're not aware, I was homeschooled. You start to connect the dots here and go, oh, okay, I get the picture here. Hold on a second. We weren't religious, especially not in the sense that you think that we were. If I grew up anything, I grew up Buddhist, going to Buddhist retreats out on the East Coast. My parents just happened to like the name Meshach, which is why I have it. So this wasn't some ultra-conservative homeschool upbringing. If anything, it was much more hippie. We used to call it alternative homeschooling. It wasn't because my parents didn't want me to learn about evolution. In fact, we spent a lot of time talking about evolution. I just wanted to clear that up and get that out of the way before we moved on. This wasn't a political or religious reason why they were homeschooling us. It was because my parents wanted to try something. They wanted to do something different. And they thought they could create an experience for us growing up that would be productive and interesting and provide us with the necessary tools to become adults in the world. So let's start with elementary school. The first chapter, the beginning. Like I said, my parents were both elementary school teachers back in the 90s, and so this was sort of the area where they were the strongest, at least initially. This was their professional focus, and so it just sort of felt normal to some degree. Like, I was somewhat aware that, like, oh, other kids are going to school, I'm not going to school, like, we're doing this homeschool thing, but it wasn't, like, the craziest thing on the planet. There were things that my parents focused on. They wanted to make sure we learned math. They wanted to make sure we learned how to read, but they weren't overly concerned with the details or super concerned with like the specific progress. It was a lot more of putting us in situations in which we could learn those things. Starting from a pretty early age, my mom would focus more on the literature, grammar, history side of things, and then my dad would focus more on the math side of things. But with most of the things that we were doing, it was sort of based on the unit. So for instance, my younger brother was born when I was in first grade, like November of my first grade year. So throughout kindergarten, I just remember talking a lot about babies. Like that was sort of our theme. We would go to the library and we would get stacks and stacks of books about babies. And we learned all about like what babies need and how babies grow and everything you could learn about babies, to the point where I actually got so frustrated. I remember being angry at my mom that we read too many books on babies, and I like wanted to read books about space. So I think actually we ended up going back to the library and checking out a bunch of books about space, which was great. There were very few curriculums that we actually had. There were very few things that were like, this is exactly what you need to do. And at least in the state of Ohio, and especially in elementary school, there's not a lot of requirements. It isn't like, oh, you need to do X, Y, and Z any given year. Like, as you're growing, if you're reading a lot of stuff, if you're doing an appropriate amount of math, you're gonna progress. And so it was all a very hands-on approach. I mean, we would sometimes for math, it was sitting down and doing something in a math workbook, but sometimes it was like going to a park and learning how to measure the circumference of trees. And at the same time, like talk about how trees grow and the different parts of a tree. And so like it ends up being like both a science and a math lesson and also like time to be outside in nature. There were a lot of things that were kind of bundled together like that. And my parents weren't overly concerned with like what are the number of hours that you're spending learning. It was much more, let's create environments in which learning can occur. And so if that environment is we're out in nature, if that environment is this is a stack of books that I want you to like find what's most interesting in and tell me about. If that environment was I need you to play with your siblings outside and maybe you're gonna go make bows and arrows out of string and sticks and shoot them at the trees, right? There was a lot of like learning by doing. We weren't being like evaluated on what we were doing, but there was a certain amount of like rigor to it. My parents weren't just letting us sit and watch TV all day. In fact, I don't even remember if we had a TV until I was like 9 or 10 years old and my grandma moved in with us. There's a lot of books and we read a lot, and we talked a lot, and we played a lot. And most of our learning had to do with that. So my sister was 2 years younger than me. My brother was 6 years younger than me. And so over the course of elementary school, we were often doing things that could kind of accommodate across multiple levels. And that's the nice thing about those projects. If we're going like for a hike to go identify birds, like there's a level at which I can understand that. There's a level at which my sister can understand that. And there's a level at which like my brother, who is 2 years old at the time, is just understanding like how to walk. So there were kind of multiple levels to everything that we were doing. And that continued throughout most of my education. Now, there were instances in which we would do things with other people. So the first thing that I remember was something called Homeschool Gym. And Homeschool Gym was started by a guy named Chris Quickert. He still does it. And Chris would travel around the city and he would do these classes for homeschool groups. And we would meet at the rec center on Thursdays and we would pack a lunch and there would be classes for, 5 and 6 year olds, 7 and 8 year olds, 9 and 10 year olds, 11 and 12 year olds. And we would go and play with dodgeballs and scooter boards and parachutes in the gym and have an absolute blast. And depending on the year, there would be somewhere between 10 and 50 other homeschool families. And some of these were homeschool families like ours. Some of them were homeschool families that had like a dozen kids. So the local rec center would get taken over every Thursday by all of these homeschool families. And that was an opportunity to socialize, right? That was an opportunity to interact with other kids. That was a time when like it felt a little bit more like what I might think school would feel like, where like you're around other people and you're having to interact with them and maybe you don't know them that well. But Thursdays were always like the best day. Also because the library was right next to the rec center. So we would often like get a bunch of books, get to go to Homeschool Gym, see a bunch of people, socialize. Thursdays were great. Once I got to second or third grade, there were a number of other families sort of in our local community that started homeschooling as well. And they had kids that were around my age, so some a little bit older, some a little bit younger than me. And so we started doing what we called Science Club. And Science Club met on Mondays. There was one parent who was a marine biologist. There was another parent who had gone through med school. Eventually, there was another parent who was an archaeologist. And so we had these like parents in our community who were super educated about science. Each year, they would put together sort of a theme for the year. This year, it's gonna be all about biology, or the next year, it's gonna be all about chemistry, or the next year, it's gonna be all about space. And we would meet on Mondays, and we would get together as a group, and there would be people ranging from like 6 years younger than me, like my brother's age, all the way up to like a year or two older than me. And we would spend the morning doing science experiments and listening to somebody talk about science. Maybe we would like watch a documentary and talk about it. This was another opportunity where we were like really doing things as a group. We were really doing things together. And much of my homeschooling kind of followed this theme, where there was this really wide range in terms of the ages of everyone involved, but everyone was still able to get something out of it. I'm still friends with almost all those people. I spent New Year's with a bunch of them this last year. And then my dad also started doing writing workshops, basically a weekly writing session. And so he does a lot of creative writing. And so he would bring us in and do these workshops where we would spend an hour doing creative writing as a group. And there would be, again, sort of a similar age range down to about my brother's age, up to like a year or two older than me. And we would spend, 45 minutes doing a writing session and then like 20 to 30 minutes sharing about what we wrote and talking about how that writing went. Again, this was a great opportunity to learn about writing. It was a great opportunity to get excited about learning, which I think a lot of this was. But it was also a time where we were socializing, where we were getting together, where we were hanging out. And I think a lot of the criticism around homeschooling comes down to like, you were never socialized. And it was definitely less socialization than someone who spends 6 or 7 hours a day in an elementary school, but you're around your siblings all of the time. So you're having to navigate family dynamics. And then there's also lots of situations where you are around other people. I think it isn't socialized in the same way that like you're just kind of forced into it. It's socialized in the sense that you have to create the environments in which that social interaction can occur. And as I was getting into the older ages of elementary school, I wanted to start doing more projects. I had these ideas, wild ambitions about things that I wanted to do. And the two big ones were I wanted to make a movie and I wanted to start a restaurant. You go, okay, you're a 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid, how are you gonna do these things? So the movie first. I wanted to make an adaptation of the book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, into a movie. I loved Roald Dahl, I loved his work, and I was just adamant that I wanted to make this into a movie. I knew that I was going to play Willy Wonka. And so I started asking my friends to like be a part of this. And it was all those people in that homeschooling group that we were in. And I wrote a script when I was, I want to say 9 or 10 years old. I like had a copy of the book that I like went through and highlighted the sections. Like I wanted to use the actual dialogue from the book. And eventually I convinced my parents, I said, I want these people to come over and we're going to film these scenes at our house and I'm going to make this into a movie. And I think it took about 2 years and there were a lot of different scenes that we had to film and there were a lot of costumes we had to get together and there were a lot of people we had to find to play all of the different roles. But over the course of those 2 years, we managed to meet enough times to shoot every single scene that we needed to make it into an actual movie. I learned how to edit. We had a family friend who gave me a copy of Final Cut Pro 3 that I edited on a 1997 iMac. I was shooting it on a JVC. Do I have the camera? Do I have the camera in here? Yes. This is the actual video camera we shot it on. This is a JVC Super VHS camera. The only way to offload footage on this is you had to plug it in to a computer and just you would press play on the camera, it would feed it into the computer, and then you had to manually set in points and out points as the footage was loading in, which I learned how to do at like age 10 or 11. God, I can't believe I have that thing. In that project, even though it wasn't like some curriculum, it provides so many life skills, right? Because like you have to put together a project that other people want to be involved in. You have to coordinate the actual event, bring people together and schedule them. You have to figure out how to actually make it happen. Okay, the logistics of we want to shoot something that's going to take place in an entirely white room. How do we make that happen? Oh wait, we have a friend and they have all of this white paper that they'd be willing to give us. If we tape that white paper up across our whole living room, we can make an entirely white room. The amount of problem solving, and then even once the footage was complete, I didn't know how to edit until after we'd shot everything. So after the fact, I was like learning how to edit and actually like put this thing together. And so doing a project like that, you learn a ton of things that wouldn't be a part of a curriculum necessarily, but are still very valuable. The restaurant. I wanted to make a restaurant. I don't know why. I was obsessed with making a restaurant and I wanted to make a pizzeria out of our house. I was 10 years old. I cannot believe my mom allowed us to do this. I brought together a group of 4 people, so it was me and my sister, and it was 2 other friends. One was a year younger than me, one was a year older than me. And we designed a menu together. We tested out dough recipes for the pizza. We went to the grocery store and priced out everything that we would need. We learned how to do profit margins. We weren't very profitable, but we like understood the concept of like, okay, if this is how much it costs, this is how much you have to price it for to actually like make money off of it. We emailed friends and family and we had to have them set up reservations. In that first year, we ran it for 1 night. We cleared out my parents' living room and put up tables and chairs, printed out menus, and we had like a legit pizza restaurant there for a night. I think there was like 30 or 40 people that came that first night, which was a lot. Like feeding 30 or 40 people, if you're 10 years old, over the course of a 6-hour night is hard. Like that's not an easy thing to do. And 1, it was exhausting. My mom helped an extraordinary amount. But again, this was another opportunity where we just learned a bunch of stuff, where we just did things and learned about them by doing the thing. Again, I was 10 years old. I can't believe I did that at 10 years old. There was a certain amount of like independence that we were given with this and a certain amount of like, if we pushed hard enough, we can make something happen. And so, but it wasn't like the things we wanted to happen were like watching a bunch of TV or playing video games. It was like, I want to make a pizza restaurant out of my house, and so we're going to do that. And I think that is sort of a snapshot of what my childhood was it was these projects that we wanted to do, and we would just kind of like do them. We just like go ahead and do them. Let's move on to middle school. What was middle school actually like being homeschooled? I think the delineation between like elementary school and middle school is not extraordinarily clear to me. Over the years, we got more curriculums. At some point, you need to like understand algebraic equations. At some point, you need to know the basics of physics. At some point, you need to like know the periodic table of elements, like the basic things, you know, maybe wouldn't come across if you're counting tree rings or doing projects. My dad would teach each of us math individually. For years we did Singapore math, which was math out of Singapore. Like I guess this is what they use in the country. Singapore math is all about mental math. For most of the equations, you weren't writing anything down. So you were learning how to do the math mentally in your head. At one point, there was this game where my dad had 2 die, and each of the die, instead of having a dot on it, had a number on it, and he would roll the die out. And like, let's say it's a 5 and a 3. You have to say what the difference is between that and 100. So, you know, he would roll it out. It would be, you know, 36, and you'd have to go 64, right? As fast as you could say like how much you'd have to add to that to get to 100. But this was an area where like we were taking some evaluations, we were taking some tests. We continued to do all of the groups that we had. So at this point we had our science club that met on Mondays. We had our homeschool gym, which met on Thursdays. We would do our writing workshop, which I think at this point was meeting after gym on Thursdays. It's hard for me to remember these dates. Around this time, my mom added a literature club. And so the literature club, sometimes it was just like me and my sister and like one or two other people. At one point, there were like 10 or 12 of us in it. We would be reading a book for a certain period of time and then doing analysis of that book. So we read a lot of classics. I mean, we read Great Gatsby, we read The Grapes of Wrath, we read Sense and Sensibility. Like, we read a lot of the books that one would read kind of in a more traditional environment. We also read a lot of books that you wouldn't read. And we would have to do analysis and like write papers about those books. And then the writing of the papers was like both an exercise in like, how do you understand and analyze text? But also, can you put together ideas in a cohesive way? Can you say things with proper grammar and spelling and punctuation? And so I think at this point it was like looking a little bit more traditional to what you might see in a school environment. Again, I don't know. I've never been in a school. I honestly only know from like other people's perspectives about what schools are even like. So there were like 4 times a week that we were meeting with other people, sometimes more, but the difference was not great between elementary and middle. It was like a little bit more structure, a little bit more curriculum focus, and just making sure that we were like learning the things that were important for us to know. I think for, kindergarten through 3rd grade, you can kind of get away with like, if you're in the world and reading a bunch of books and like doing some basic math flashcards, you're going to be fine. Like, you're going to get it, especially if your parents are like paying very close attention and reading to you every day and like, very focused on your education and having educational conversations with you. But as time went on, we definitely added a little bit more structure into what we were doing. But we also added more projects in. So let me think about this. I was 12, so I would have been in 6th grade when we did the second Popeyes pizza. So that was the first restaurant, the first Popeyes pizza. The second pizza restaurant we did was way bigger than the first. So the first one, there were 4 of us. The second one, there might have been 10 of us that came together to do it. Like, it was big. It was a big endeavor. And this time we were going to do for 2 nights. We were going to take a different approach. One, we were going to source our tomatoes by growing them, which is crazy. There was a woman in our community who was excited and willing for us to use her backyard to grow our tomatoes. And so she had these like garden beds back there that were perfect. And so somebody would have to go every couple of days to like tend the tomatoes and weed them and then actually like harvest the tomatoes when they got ready. And like that was how we had the sauce for the restaurant. We grew our own tomatoes. So we're gonna do the restaurant for 2 nights this time, which means we were gonna need a lot more ingredients and we were gonna have a lot more people involved. So we wanted to source flour that was gonna be organic, but that was also gonna be like cost effective. And so there was this local grocery store near us, this like little co-op. We met with the manager and talked to her about how to get like bulk discounts on things. We bought flour basically straight from I was 12 years old. This is crazy to think back. Like, I was 12 years old and I'm sitting in meetings with a clipboard and a pen, talking to like a grocery store manager and getting like bulk freight prices on flour and like learning how to negotiate those prices and saying like, okay, they can get down to like a 10% profit margin, but below that they can't actually do. They're willing to make these cuts on these things, not on these things. Like, and it was great. It was so cool. And that's how we sourced our flour for the restaurant. So this time it was a lot more of like, my mom, I think, wanted to make it an even more educational experience, and we could take all of the learnings that we had from the first time that we did it. So we pared back the menu, we learned about if we do the dough in this way ahead of time and we package it, then we can have dough that we can pull out and we can do it. We learned more about like food prep and food safety. The second time we did Popeyes Pizza, it felt like a really legit restaurant. Like, we did 2 nights. Our living room looked even more like a pizza restaurant that time around. Like, it was really cool. There's so much stuff in here now. Like, thinking back on it, we were just doing so many projects. For one, I really wanted to do a summer camp. Like, I thought, let's do a summer camp, base it out of our house. We have this beautiful backyard. We could have kids come over. We could do half days for a week. And it could be like a really fun outdoor camp where we like play camp games and like have water balloon fights and just like have it be a great time. I'm 12 at this point, 11 or 12. And so I pitched this idea to my mom and she's actually on board. She thinks it's a good idea. I end up doing it with my sister, someone else we homeschooled with who was like a year between us. And the initials of our names spelled AME. And so it was Camp AIM. AME, and we did it for a week. We didn't charge for it. We just sort of like took donations as people wanted to. It was really an experiment. And again, this was something we had to like, okay, you want to do a camp for a week. How do you advertise the camp that you're doing? How do you find people that want to do it? How do you break up the workload of like what the camp is actually going to be? How do you provide cool and interesting things for the kids coming to the camp? There was so much learning that was taking place in like practically doing something like that. I only did the camp, I think we did it that year and then the following year. My sister ended up continuing to do that camp through the end of high school. She ran a version of that camp for years and years after that, eventually getting featured on like the local news about the camp that she was doing. And like a legit business that she had. It was amazing. At this point, we also did robotics. Like we had a homeschool group that did like a robotics competition. And so as a group, we would meet, I think we were meeting like twice a week, and we had to design like a Lego robot that could complete this obstacle course. And we had to design like projects based on it. That was called First Lego League. We did that for 2 years. At one point in here, we got the opportunity. Somebody had a radio station. It was a sort of a friend of a friend connection. And he had like a radio station. It was a local radio station. And he had a show. And it was like on for whatever, 3 hours every week. So he let us take 30 minutes out of his show to do our own radio show. And so it was called Kids Speak Columbus. And so we had an actual radio program, and we would like prep what we were gonna do on the radio, and we did it live. We brought people in. I remember one time we did like an interview with another kid who had like written a novel that had come out, and so we like had her on the show and we like talked to her about her novel. And then we had like other segments that we presented and prepared, topics that we researched and then talked about on air. It was really fun. But all of these projects, like they weren't specifically based on any one single curriculum, but the number of skills that are sort of clustered around how to put together a radio show, or how to design a robot to complete a course, or how to put together a summer camp, or how to make a pizza restaurant. Like all of these required so many skills to be developed. And I think that was the strength of a lot of what we were doing, was like there was so many instances in which we could just like develop skills and work on things. At some point in here as a family, we started volunteering. So the Metro Park in Columbus, called Slate Run, they have a historical farm that functions in the way a farm from the 1880s would. This was my sister's idea. You could volunteer on that farm as basically one of the people in costume. It wasn't an acting gig. This was something where you were actually going out and you were actually doing the farm duties that someone from the 1880s would. You just happened to be in costume. So like I learned how to brush horses and clean stalls and, you know, collect eggs. I learned how to blacksmith at one point. Like that was cool. But a lot of it was like really mundane tasks. Like I hadn't shucked sorghum before. I don't know if many people do shuck sorghum, but a sorghum stalk grows and you have a little wooden sword basically, and you have to cut the leaves off the bottom so the stalk grows up. You stand out in the middle of the field with a straw hat on for like 4 hours. But it was, again, it was like one of these experiences that like at the time I remember being kind of annoyed. Like it was frustrating. Like I didn't want to dress up in, I was 11 years old, 12 years old, 13 years old. I didn't want to like dress up in costume and go be on a historical farm and like learn how to bale hay. But in retrospect, what a cool experience. Like I got to do that. That was awesome. As I was going through this, I was also getting way more into filmmaking. So around 6th grade, I finally finished the Willy Wonka movie. And then I started working on another movie. And this was an adaptation of the book Lunch Money by Andrew Clements. If you haven't read it, it's a fantastic book. Highly recommend it. But I took this book and I was like, this needs to be a movie. I feel like I can make this into a movie. Bought a copy of the book and I wrote a script using the actual dialogue from the book once again and turned this into a screenplay. So I was also playing the main character, but this one took place in a school. Like most of the book takes place in a school. And so in order to get a school, because we didn't have access to a school, there was a library, and I learned you could rent a meeting room in the library and you could basically set it up to make it look like a classroom or a lunchroom. And so we rented this space in the library, and I sent out an email because I wanted actual adults to play the adults in the movie. Like in the Willy Wonka movie, it was just all kids. So I wanted actual adults to play the adults. And I sent out an email to like family and friends, and a bunch of people were like, yeah, we'd love to be in your movie. We actually made a movie with adults in it. We had a real script for it, and I, at this point, knew how to edit, so I was like on top of the editing for it. This one we premiered. We got someone who had like a local art studio. We charged people like $3 to come and sit in a chair. It was like 40 minutes long. We played the film for them. And actually the movie's up on YouTube. I'll link to it if you want to watch it. Like it still exists, but you know, it's made by a 12-year-old, so take it with a grain of salt. It was like a real project that I felt like was like an actual movie. We shot sections of it like at the rec center while we were at Homeschool Gym. That was what I felt like, okay, now I can do this. Like now I can actually make movies. It was a slightly better camera, not a great camera yet, but it was a slightly better camera. And I was like learning the basics of like, okay, this is how you edit. This is how you put these things together. Again, it was all of these projects. Like, yes, there was like math and history and kind of the basics were being learned as well. But so much of my education was like these projects that we were sinking our teeth into and actually doing. So moving on to high school, again, these transitions were smooth. It wasn't like, okay, now you're in ninth grade, it's gonna be totally different. Like, it was still very similar, right? Maybe the rigor was turned up a little bit. At the beginning of each year, my parents and I, we'd often like sit down and decide like, okay, what are the things you want to do this year? Like, what are the actual projects you want to get done? What are the things you want to focus on? So I think at some point in high school, it was like, well, you need to do these math classes. You need to have a little bit more rigorous science. And so you're going to take this biology class, which is like a DVD series, or you're going to like read this physics textbook and take these quizzes to like make sure you're understanding the material. But again, it was a lot of projects. It was a lot of like learning by doing. At this point, my parents were much more hands-off. So instead of being like the ones teaching me how to do the things, they were like the ones monitoring. Like, okay, you need to read like 5 chapters of this history book this week, and then maybe like write me a couple of paragraphs about it that I can read by the end of the week to like make sure that you're doing it. I actually even have a bunch of the stuff from high school. So this is like a project I did on the garbanzo bean. I guess I was really excited about garbanzo beans at the time. Algebra for 5 hours a week. American history for 2 hours and 45 minutes a week. Language arts, spelling, vocab, Latin for 4 hours a week. Writing club and writing with skill for 3 hours a week. Biology, 4+ hours a week. Reading, literature, 5+ hours a week. At the bottom, times and dates are flexible. Look at totals for the week. The goal was like put together systems where you can do things, where you can just like learn things and then just go and do them. That would be like a good example of like, that was what my weeks looked like. At some point in all of this, I realized if I got up and immediately started working at like 5 a.m., I could be done by like 11 or 12. And so I did that for most of high school. I would get up at 5 a.m. and I would like knock things out all morning, and then I would be good in the afternoon. And that was the way I was also able to do lots of other film projects. So like around this point, I started making my feature film, The Red Crystal, also available on YouTube. If you have any interest in watching it, it is out there. But that film was like a proper feature film. I wrote the entire script originally. I cast a bunch of people to be in it. We had to like build sets for it. I learned how to use green screens for it. We got like a proper digital camera for it to shoot it. That was like a legit movie. And that was the summer right before I started high school that we shot it, but then it kind of continued into high school that I was actually making that film and actually making it into like a real movie. And by the time it was properly done, I was like 16. We ended up renting out a local theater and premiering it there, which was just like a crazy experience to have your movie that you shot like in a theater. We had like 150 people come. There were like a number of like articles written about it. It was really cool. It was like a really cool experience. But again, it was like one of those projects where like, how do you negotiate with a theater? Like that's a skill that you're not going to learn in a classroom, but you're going to learn by actually doing. And so throughout high school, I was also making more films. So I tried to make the following summer, I tried to make a sequel to that first movie, ended up going way overboard on it. We only shot about a third of the movie and had to scrap it because actors dropped out. And like, but that one was, I mean, I built tunnels in my basement out of chicken wire, paper mache, and wood structures to build like underground tunnels. We had a full jail that we built for it to like shoot this like jail sequence in. I had all of these people involved in it. I just like went way overboard and it like was never something that could ever be completed. But man, it was a massive undertaking. Ended up making a Doctor Who show, also on YouTube still. I was a huge Doctor Who fan at the time, and so put up those episodes on there. But my parents let me use their garage as my production studio, and so I would spend the mornings doing more traditional schoolwork, and then I would spend the afternoons like creating videos or working on a script or editing the movie that I was making. Toward the end of high school, I got a group of people together. I really wanted to make a sitcom. I was so obsessed with like Friends and Frasier and, you know, all of those, How I Met Your Mother, all those classic sitcoms. And so my buddy Marco and I wrote a 5-episode sitcom, and we got a group of people together to shoot it. And we met 3 times a week for like 6 weeks in our garage and shot every single episode of that sitcom. Ended up never releasing it for a myriad of reasons. That's a whole nother video. It was a lot of like making things. It was actually doing things. It was going out and creating things. And throughout this, I had the opportunity. I could have gone to high school. Like by the time I got to this age, it was sort of like, if you want to go to high school, great, like go to high school. I had so much freedom. I was able to just to make things all of the time that I wanted to make. And I wasn't really lacking a ton of social connection. I was still seeing people throughout the week. And I considered it a couple of times. I thought like I could go to high school, like that might be a cool experience, but ultimately it was like, I don't want to do that because it would mean that I can't do all of the stuff that I'm doing right now that I love. That was the trade-off, and that's why I made the decision ultimately never to go to high school. When I was 16, I started taking classes at the local community college. So there's a program called College Credit Plus where you can go in and actually take classes. So that was the first time I was ever in a classroom. I took an American history class. I also took Spanish classes there. I took a business class there. I tried to take a Latin class there. It was so hard, I ended up dropping out of it. I took a film class there. So that gave me a little bit of a sense of like, this is what college is gonna be like. Like you have to show up to classes and you have to like do the work. It was just really positive. Like having that experience of like being in a classroom and having someone who was actually gonna like tell me what the assignment was and that I just had to do it was really refreshing. I think a lot of like this whole homeschool thing is you have to be self-motivated and self-prepared. Like there's a world in which I could have like woken up at noon every day and not really done anything, but that wasn't the kind of homeschooling that we were doing. We were doing active homeschooling. We were out actually doing things. Maybe it's just my personality that I like to do things. I like to create things. I like to make things in the world. For me, homeschooling was like less about the education and more just about this overall mindset that like you can do anything. You can make stuff. You want to make a pizza restaurant in your house? Do it. You want to make a movie? Do it. You want to make a summer camp? Do it. A lot of those mindsets have carried over into my adulthood, where I see people that kind of went through a little bit more of a traditional system, and it feels like there's some limiting beliefs around like, well, I could never do that. And it's like, really? You couldn't? Like, I think you could. And I know that's like the homeschooling side of me coming out. I just have this belief that I can do things. So more than anything, it allowed me to explore my passions. It allowed me to like explore things that really excited me and make really cool stuff. Are there aspects I regret? Yeah, of course. I mean, it wasn't perfect at all. I'm painting a very rosy picture in this video, but by no means was it perfect. I think especially once I started college, I realized how different my childhood was compared to other people's. And I remember for the first couple of weeks, I really felt left out on like everyone had experienced this collective trauma of school, and I just hadn't. Like I was in love with learning. I thought my classes in college were great. I was just excited to be there. And other people had a little bit more of this like pessimistic, nihilistic view of things. I just didn't have that. I still don't have that. And there are ways in which that's a huge advantage to me. Temporarily, it may have made it like harder to fit in when it came to college, but I made friends. I like had great connections. Like ultimately it all ended up well. And now approaching 25 is, you know, I feel like a relatively well-adjusted adult. Like I'm getting married this summer. I have my life in pretty good order. I could not have asked for a different childhood. I got a lot of good out of it, but it's not for everyone either. I think there are ways in which my younger siblings, it wasn't quite as good of a fit for them. Like I was very self-propelled and I wanted to do these things. And I think the theme of this whole story is like, there are things that I wanted to actualize in the world. There were things that I wanted to make. I wanted to make them happen. And I would bring a group of people together and I would say, let's do it. Like, let's actually make this thing happen. And to their credit, people would like get excited and actually do it. But I could totally see if you don't have that mentality, if you're maybe a little bit more introverted. I just as easily could have spent a ton of time just watching TV and not actually creating stuff. But for whatever reason, my personality, I don't care about playing Minecraft. I would much rather like dig an actual hole outside. I like to do things in the real world, and this was an opportunity for me to do those things. I don't want to prescribe homeschooling on anyone. It was a wild ride. And there are times now where I feel a little bit like the odd man out when everyone around me kind of went to school and they have all these experiences. So there's like a large part of the world that I feel like I missed out on, but I also was able to get so much by missing out on it. And you can't split test life. Like, I don't know what my life would have been like had I not been homeschooled. I don't know if I would have been similar to who I am now or someone totally different. Like, we'll never know the answer to that. But I'm really happy with many of the ways that I turned out, and I think homeschooling was a big piece of that. So I would love to hear any questions you have down in the comments below. I imagine that there's a lot of them. This was a wild, long, crazy video. So if you made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found it entertaining and insightful, and I love talking about this stuff. It's like once I get going, I can't stop. So that's my story. I'll see you guys next time.